Here's a little bit of a cartoon. It gives us an image. The next slide. Jesus clears the temple on his skateboard. So this is often called the clearing or the cleansing of the temple. Jesus creates a whip, overturns the tables and the money changers, drives out sheep and cattle and doves, accusing people of destroying his temple. And Jesus, I think, cracks the whip, and with a loud voice, Jesus says, "Get your things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a shopping mall." Now, I don't like this angry-looking Jesus. I don't really want a Jesus who carries a whip of judgment around sacred spaces, making a mess of things, throwing everything into confusion. I like a nice European looking Jesus with light skin, who is not threatening, who has a nice light halo and a peace sign. Isn't that the Jesus we all like? But I'm afraid this is the Jesus that we've been sold by white European churches throughout the ages. You see, my friends, we are awash in Jesus fiction. It's not surprising that Jesus is the best known figure in history, but in many ways, he's also the least known. Biblical archaeology tells us this is what Jesus more than likely looked like. Take a look. Isn't it strange that Americans worship a guy that they wouldn't be comfortable sitting beside on a plane? In preparing for this message and to find some intellectual and spiritual fodder, I went to one of my favorite websites entitled Journey with Jesus. It's a website by Daniel Clendiden. And I met actually Daniel when I was living in Novosibirsk, Siberia. He was teaching at the University of Moscow in the Department of Scientific Atheism, which is very strange because he is a progressive Protestant. And this week, though, on his blog, he highlighted the reflections of a woman by the name of Debbie Thomas, whose face is actually missing. Debbie opened my eyes to a song as I read through the blog from one of my favorite composers outside of Ray, Brian Wren. And I always love his lyrics, but I never like his melodies. So I didn't want anybody to try to play this song. The song is Good as the Flesh, and it dropped me dead in my tracks, actually, as I read over this song. And listen to these words. Close your eyes if you'd like and melt into the words of this song. Good is the flesh that the Word has become. Good is the birthing, the milk in the breast. Good is the feeding, caressing, and rest. Good is the body for knowing the world. Good is the flesh that the Word has become. Good is the body for knowing the world, sensing the sunlight, the tug of the ground, feeling and perceiving within and around. Good is the body from cradle to grave. Good is the flesh that the Word has become. Good is the body from cradle to grave, growing and aging, arousing, impaired, happy in clothing or lovingly bared. Good is the pleasure of God in our flesh. Good is the flesh that the Word has become. Good is the pleasure of God in our flesh. Good is the flesh. That is not a phrase I've heard much in my church experience. I didn't hear it in my seminary experience either. I learned very early on that we have a doctrine called the incarnation, that God becomes man in Jesus. But I didn't learn to link that particular teaching or that doctrine of incarnation to actual bodies, to actual flesh, to your flesh and to my flesh. For most of us, we've been sold that bill of goods that says that the body is bad, that the flesh is sinful, that this body is temporary and will pass away. Most of us, we carry a lot of shame in our bodies, don't we? Few of us have perfect bodies, at least in the eyes of the world. We're either too short, we're too tall, something is too small, and something is too large. We're fat, we're thin, we're too young, we're too old. I don't need to tell you. I was not taught to honor sacredness of skin, of limbs and muscles and hair, mine or anyone else's. In fact, I was taught that I must bring my flesh or my body into submission. And most of what I'd like to do with my body that is pleasurable is wrong. So what temple was Jesus talking about here when he takes the whip and he goes into the sacred space? John makes it clear. He wasn't talking about this temple, which is the temple that Jesus was in on the day. And he's not talking about this temple that we're sitting in today. Jesus was referring to his sacred space, to his body, to his temple, and therefore about our sacred bodies and our temples, because our bodies are where God dwells. Our bodies are God's sacred space, just as Jesus' body was the container of the divine. And so when Jesus is in the temple whipping up the money changers, they misunderstood what Jesus was attempting to illustrate. And when he said that he will destroy this temple in 3 days and build it in 3 days, he wasn't referring to the temple that Herod had spent years building of brick and stone. He was referring to his own body. Jesus is alive. His body would be put to death by those who feared him, but his body would come back to life in 3 days. He was saying God resides in a different kind of temple altogether, the temple of Jesus' body and the temple of your body. So during the season of Lent, with all of the crazy shootings and deportation threats and all these crimes against humanity, I'm thinking and I'm actually praying a lot about what it means to honor human bodies. What it means to honor your body, what it means to honor my body. Because our bodies are holy places, all 140, 150 of you here today. You are a holy place of the divine. And it's not easy to remember that in a religious culture that views the body as inherently sinful from birth and shameful and dangerous. And it's not easy to do that in a secular culture that makes the body a commodity, cheapening it for the sake of profit. It's not easy to do that in a culture that says, if you got darker skin than mine, you don't matter as much as me. Most of the time, I see my own body as something I need to shrink, lose weight, conquer, or tame. I see its flaws so much clearer than I see God and the beauty that God has given me and the divinity that God has given me. Rarely do I see my body necessarily as a vehicle of worship or love or hospitality and grace. We are people of the incarnation. That's who we are in this space. In the truest sense, we are called to look. We are called to see. We are called to break bread. We are called to share wine. And we are called to wash each other's terribly ugly feet. How can we learn to see embodied lives? How can we move past the contempt, the squeamishness, the fear, and offer God our whole selves? How can we welcome the pleasure of God in our flesh, as Brian Wren writes? What Jesus calls out when he cleanses the temple and he clears the temple with the whip, he's not talking about the various forms of the worship that Jews had. What he's calling out is a system of exploitation. That's the deeper story in this reading. It's a system of exploitation that collects tithes and taxes and blocks access to God. that literally keeps the bodies of the poor people outside the gates of the temple, forcing them into more and endless debt before they can approach and worship God. That's what was going on. That's the deeper story. That's the backstory. Barbara Brown Taylor, who is a friend of mine, wrote in her book, An Altar in the World, she says, "It is not possible to lean into God's love for my body without simultaneously recognizing that God loves all bodies everywhere. The bodies of the hungry children and indentured women along the bodies of sleek athletes and cigar-smoking tycoons. One of the truer things about bodies," Taylor says, "is that it is just about impossible to increase the reverence I show mine without also increasing the reverence I show yours." In other words, when I value my own body as God's temple, when you value your own body as God's temple, as a site of God's pleasure, as a site of God's goodness and grace, literally a site of worship because all that you do brings goodness and glory to God, I cannot stand by while other bodies suffer exploitation, poverty, discrimination, or abuse. That's what Jesus was getting at in the temple. Eric Gardner, I thank you for your short life. 3 years, just like Jesus. Short lives can make incredible impacts. Thanks for reminding us, Eric, that Black Lives Matter. Like we shouldn't understand that? A couple of years ago when the Black Lives Movement started, I would argue with folks who would say, "James, all lives matter. Stop saying Black Lives Matter." Well, yes, they do. But Black Lives mattered, especially then because of the discrimination and injustice was so intense. And it continues. I was here yesterday with about 125 black men and a few white folks sprinkled in and a few brown bodies sprinkled in, talking about the pain and experience they have living as black men in the culture. And in our current culture, we must admit that, yeah, brown bodies matter, homeless bodies matter, wrinkled bodies matter, non-gender conforming bodies matter, and otherly abled bodies matter, and yes, every life matters. Apparently, Jesus could not stand by with his God-given body and watch other God-given bodies being ignored or considered as less than in God's temple. He interrupted worship for the sake of justice, and maybe Jesus sometimes wants to do that with us. I'm not sure. I would prefer if he did not come with a whip. But Jesus, moved to compassion and righteous anger, would not stand for the violation of any sanctuary, any body that holds the divine. The house of God is in you. The house of God is in us. If human bodies are really temples, holy places where heaven and earth meet, then we must work as Jesus did to preserve and protect these holy places from every form of irreverence and desecration. I experienced deep pain in my body. Yesterday, as I was sitting with these men, I had some deep pain in my heart and my mind and my spirit. And I had some anger. I felt terror. I also had deep pleasure and deep happiness and deep joy. Simeon, who is a new theologian, although he lived 1,000 years ago, that's kind of his nickname. Simeon, the new theologian, was a Greek Orthodox individual who was also on many icons. And he said this about 1,000 years ago. This is incredibly profound. He said, "For if we genuinely love Jesus, we wake up inside Christ's body." Isn't that beautiful? If we genuinely love Jesus, we wake up inside Christ's body, where all of our body, all over, every most hidden part of our body is realized in joy as him, and he makes us utterly real. And then he goes on to say, and everything that is hurt, everything that seems dark to us, Everything that seems harsh and shameful and maimed and ugly and irreparably damaged is in Jesus transformed. Transformed. And it is recognized as whole and lovely and radiant and beloved, every last part of our body. So today, as I embrace this image of Jesus whipping folks into shape in the temple, Jesus shows zeal. Jesus shows passion. Jesus shows a little bit of anger. And in his red-faced anger, Jesus affirms your body and my body as he affirms his own body, which would come to life. And Jesus says there that every body matters. My body, your body, our body, because they are the incarnation of the divine. I'd like to give you these closing words. You are human. You are divine. Together we are the presence of Jesus on earth, and we matter. You matter. Your life matters. Your place in life matters. No matter what age, no matter how many years you live, no matter where you live, you matter because you are the sanctuary, the very temple of God. That's kind of where we begin. That's where we start. That's where Lent begins, and that's where Lent ends.